You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the former Conservative MP and CEO of the charity Business in the Community, Mary Macleod, and journalist and author Rachel Shabi. They'll be with us from now right up until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Partygate report handed down today is dominating the front pages, beginning with the Mail, which quotes Boris Johnson, who denies misleading Parliament over lockdown parties. Boris Johnson's comeback in peril, says the Eye, after text messages revealed in today's report. The Guardian says there's fresh evidence that Mr Johnson misled MPs, while the Times says MPs could punish Boris Johnson over the gatherings. He knew, writes the Mirror, about lockdown parties in number 10. The Express follows suit with the Partygate probe. The Star refers to the former PM as a fibber by comparing him to Pinocchio. Matt Hancock leads the Telegraph's coverage tomorrow with a battle over COVID restrictions between he and Rishi Sunak. Arms snub to City blamed on FCA reads the front of the Financial Times as it explores reasons why the stock has behaved in that manner. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by former Conservative MP and advisor to the Royal Household, who's now Chief Executive of the charity Business in the Community, Mary Macleod, and journalist and author Rachel Shabi. Thank you both. Good to see you. Let's start with the Eye newspaper and their headline, Boris comeback in peril after damning texts from own staff. Rachel, you take us into this story.
Sure. So the Eye and obviously a lot of other papers are covering this story, and the Eye gives us a rundown of what the revelations are. So this is an interim report from the Privileges Committee. It's basically indicating its areas of interest, and it's doing that ahead of calling up witnesses, including Boris Johnson himself, later this month. And so what it's saying is that it would have been obvious, quote, to Boris Johnson that the events that he attended at number 10 were, in fact, would in fact have been illegal under the lockdown rules and social distancing rules at the time. There's also evidence emerging that his own staff, and particularly his comm staff, were frustrated with this, were frustrated with what this would look like were it to be leaked, which obviously it was. And also that he, Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister, knew about there'd be these after work drinks things on Fridays in number 10. And Boris not only knew that these were taking place, but in fact, occasionally attended them. So those are the main revelations from this Privileges Committee that have emerged today.
Yes, and Mary, according to the Eye, senior numbers 10 staff thought there was a great gaping hole in his denials about illegal lockdown parties.
Yes, and we don't know how many staff these come from, but there are certainly some that are there and have been seen, so therefore that he needs to answer to that. What's interesting about the Eye headline is that it sort of assumes a Boris Johnson comeback, or when it says that his comeback is in peril, because that's a whole other story, though, for another day. But yes, I mean, this is a difficult one, and a story that just doesn't seem to go away, and what's frustrating, it just needs to be resolved, and hopefully that will be done really quickly once he goes in front of them. But it's just, Boris Johnson will say very strongly that he hasn't misled MPs, and it will be up to the committee to make a judgment on that. And it's he thinks the report will clear him. He is saying that very strongly, but yeah, he's got to convince quite a lot of people, and of course it'll then go to, if it's found that he has misled Parliament anyway. That, of course, goes to Parliament as well, to an MPs to take a view on. So this is a point where he is definitely trying to probably fight for survival on this. And they will have to make a judgment call on whether they think he really believed at the time that he was breaking any rules.
Let's move on to the Express. Also, same story. He's saying that the Partygate probe, this is Boris Johnson, this is his quote, that it's a cynical stitch-up. This was an investigation that he actually praised previously, though, wasn't it, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, just to put into context this claim that he didn't know and that he wasn't lying, the Times has got a quote from from the committee where one witness told Johnson at a crowded event at Number 10 in November 2020, when obviously those rules were in place, one witness actually said to Johnson that this was, quote, probably the most unsocially distanced gathering in the UK. So he's actually being told that by someone he's standing next to at one of these illegal events. So it's, again, another sort of strand of how far this is stretching the imagination that he didn't know. He's cynically accusing Sue Gray of being politically motivated. I have to say, it does not help, in my view, that Labour has plans to appoint her chief of staff, because it does essentially open the door to these kinds of accusations. I'm not saying the accusations are true at all. I'm just saying that it was unwise, to put it mildly, for Labour to open this door. But actually what we're saying with a lot of these fronts is just how politically motivated the tone of these front pages are. So we've got the Mirror saying, well, he lied, and we've got the Daily Mail sort of saying, well, he'll be fine, he was vindicated, which are obviously very, very different lines to take.
Yes, the Express also saying, and quoting in quote marks, vindicated, which is what Boris Johnson's saying, that he has been by the report, and this is before he gives evidence to Parliament, Mary.
Yes, and then it says there on the front page of the Express, it's that it's that whole thing around, did he knowingly mislead Parliament, and they will judge that. But I agree about the Sue Gray appointment. It would have been good if they'd held off a few weeks, perhaps, to make that announcement as part of this, because it looks like it's muddying the water. I mean, she's a senior civil servant with years of experience, but it just creates an additional angle on this story that's sort of not needed right now. But it's this hopefully will get resolved very, very quickly. But it's Boris will continue to fight on what he thinks is right. And the thing is, there are photographs there that show certainly Number 10 staff having a drink. And therefore he's really got to prove that he knowingly didn't lie about it, that he didn't feel at the time they were breaking any rules. So,
there are those,
he's got work to do in the next 2 weeks.
Yes, and as you say, the photographs there that we hadn't previously seen, but still he's insisting that there's no evidence that he misled MPs, Rachel.
Fine, but there are pictures. There are actual pictures. And I just think the evidence is just becoming more and more. It's like an avalanche now. And as this, I'm just going to repeat what this Privileges Committee has said, that it would have been obvious, quote, for him that those gatherings would have been illegal. I think the idea that would have been obvious to him does suggest that he knew and misled. And when we look at the Times, it's suggesting that his own MPs are increasingly disgruntled with this and are, trying to look at ways that potentially that this might have political consequences for him, potentially being suspended for the party, potentially having to stand for a by-election in his seat in Uxbridge if he gets if he gets deselected by his own local constituency party. But it is interesting that some of the Conservatives are trying to do that. I mean, obviously, it would be a clear dividing line for Sunak to have faced down Team Boris inside the Conservatives, but it also speaks to the Conservatives' incredible capacity to constantly reinvent themselves or want to appear to by ditching their former leader and then saying, well, it was nothing to do with us. It's a brand new party now, as though they didn't all serve under him and agree with him at the time.
The Times does throw it forward, Mary, as in what could happen to Boris Johnson, and his potentially his political career could be ended.
Yes, no, absolutely, and I think that's why he will absolutely be fighting to get his side of the story and to prove that, and hopefully that for him that it will vindicate him. But I mean, this continues to be a very sensitive story generally, because the whole public perception is just not good. And I think what's happening with members of parliament is that they're just getting frustrated that this story is still out there, because it doesn't do his party any good. It doesn't do politicians and politics and government and parliament any good, because lots of people during COVID had just such horrific things to deal with. And my mother died during the pandemic, but thankfully I was allowed into hospital for the last 2 days to see her. But lots of people weren't, and had to suffer real hardship and difficulties, and didn't get anywhere near their loved ones during that time. So it's hugely sensitive across the country, this whole story. But I think that MPs will be getting really frustrated that it's still being talked about and that they just want an end to it, however it's resolved.
And you were mentioning, Rachel, that Rishi Sunak will have to face up to this as well, because the Privileges Committee eventual verdict will have to be approved by the House of Commons. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think, I think Mary raises a really important point that, this can turn into a he said, she said, they said, whatever, gossipy lobby journalists doing the insider parliamentary track. But actually, there were very real consequences at that time. There are lots of people up and down this country who are still hurting, who are still grieving, who are still mourning, who are still coping with all kinds of issues around the sacrifices that people needed to make around that time. And so that's the reason why this is such a burning issue. It's not about, Sunak's management or whatever of the party. It's not about Boris Johnson staging a comeback or not. It's the fact that lots of people, put up with such a lot during that time. And it looked like the people who are in charge of making those rules were breaking them. So of course this is going to go on until it is resolved, until we know one way or the other.
Indeed. Rachel and Mary, for the moment, thank you. We are going to take a break. Much more coming up. We'll continue the press preview of this story on page 2 of the Express. Its headline, 999 strikes called off for fresh pay talks. Stay with us for more. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, former Conservative MP and CEO of the charity Business in the Community, Mary Macleod, and journalist and author Rachel Shabi. Welcome back to both of you. Let's have a look at the Telegraph, and we're looking at the Matt Hancock story and the revelations from the various WhatsApp messages and what they revealed today. Another day from what the Telegraph are calling their lockdown files. And we read that Rishi Sunak and Matt Hancock were locking horns over the pandemic and the handling in terms of lockdown. Mary. Oh, we've lost Mary's sound.
Sorry about that.
There you are.
I'm back again. Yes, this is in essence the lockdown files and Matt Hancock trying to get Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, to in sort of what seems to be in sort of rows over COVID restrictions, and just on what those the extent of those lockdown measures and those restrictions should be, and just and I guess the frustrations that went with that. But the WhatsApp messages, of course, published, you get a sense of that as part of it. And I guess there's definitely a lessons learned on what you put in a WhatsApp message for anyone, I think, in being able to see some of this that's now come to light. And so, of course, it then questions what Simon Case and what his role in this as well. But yeah, it just goes to the complexities of COVID. I mean, there's part of this that, you know, I sort of take into account the fact that it was such a difficult time for anyone trying to make decisions at this point in time, and I think all governments around the world were struggling with it to some extent because it was something new, and therefore it was a very stressful, intense time. So to some extent, I'm not surprised about some of these things, but they're now, of course, coming to light about the how awkward some of those exchanges actually
there is some of the detail that's pointing towards the rivalry that was in cabinet, Rachel, and there's a section here saying that both Mr Hancock and Rishi Sunak had ambitions for higher office, and messages that have been seen by the Telegraph suggest a level of paranoia from Mr Hancock over his colleagues' access to Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I think you're right that these messages do point to that kind of rivalry and the tensions between them. But I think what this speaks to, if we can just pan wider for a second, is the trouble with these being leaked to a newspaper that has such a clear agenda. Now, this is an anti-lockdown newspaper. It's called this investigation, the lockdown files. So it clearly has an agenda. And we're starting to see that agenda emerge when we look at this particular story, because what they're trying to say is that actually Hancock was paranoid, Rishi Sunak, then Treasury, and Alok Sharma, then Business Secretary, were both trying to get him not to impose various lockdown measures that he wanted to impose. So you can see clearly there that there actually is an agenda here to portray Hancock as overzealous, if you like, on the lockdown. And it's interesting that they choose to lead with this story and not another story in their inside pages where they're talking about how Hancock is ridiculing Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which you'll remember ran as a kind of, discount incentive for people to go and eat out in restaurants and cafes. Hancock called this Eat Out to Help Spread the Virus about as a joke, and then later said, no, actually, we've got evidence, quite clear evidence, that this scheme is helping to spread the virus. That seems to me much more important and much more consequential than a kind of rivalry political spat that is going on between Hancock and his political peers.
OK. Mary, just update us on the ambulance workers' strikes.
Yes, what's really sort of good news is about the strikes planned by ambulance workers for next week have been suspended. Really good news on that, because they wouldn't have wanted to go on strike. It is a sort of last resort, but they have ministers who are going to discuss a pay with them, and that they are looking also about improving paramedics' terms and conditions. So,
sorry, we are running out of time, Mary. But just to say, that's GMB and Unison, but Unite are still taking strike action. Thank you so much both for taking us through the papers. We'll see you in the next hour.